Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Adrenal Physiology and the Stress Response Correlated with Methylation Status and its Effect on Mood Behavior and Mental Health. My name is Max Langers, and I am the Functional Medicine Consultant at QO Labs, the proud sponsor of today's Functional Medicine Consultant, proud sponsor of moderator for the presentation. To give you a little bit of a background about QO Labs, we are a healthcare professional supplement company with a mission of providing safe, unique, and efficacious products for both doctors and their patients. We make a promise to deliver products with clinically backed ingredients and dosages shown to be effective in humans. We would like to remind you that your active participation is important throughout the webinar. Right now, I have everyone on mute to avoid background noise, but that may distract you from listening to the discussion. During the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter, Dr. Loren Marks, by typing your questions into the Q&A section of the control panel located at the bottom of your screen, appropriately labeled Q&A. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. And without further ado, I would now like to introduce Dr. Loren Marks, chiropractor and CEO of On the Mark Health and Wellness in New York City, and Diplomate of the American Chiropractic Board of Nutrition. Dr. Loren Marks is a 1984 graduate of New York Chiropractic College. He received his Diplomate in Nutrition in 2003 from the American Clinical Board of Nutrition, and has been in practice in New York for over 32 years and has taught clinical nutrition for over 25 years across the US. He's a postgraduate instructor for Logan University and is a noted speaker and a frequent lecturer for the profession as well. Dr. Marks is the founder of Integrative Assessment Technique, IAT, an assessment methodology embracing nutritional biochemistry, emotions, and structural neurology. Dr. Marks is co-author of the chapter in Dr. Andrew Weils' series of texts on Integrative Gastroenterology written by Dr. Gerard Mullin M.D., and he co-authored the chapter Arachidontis Evidence Revealed with Dr. Mullin as well by Dr. Antonia Aldretti. He has also written the foreword for a recently published children's book titled Free to Be Gluten-Free by Heather Spergel. And without further ado, Dr. Marks, I'll let you take over.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for your time this evening on addressing a very important and clinically relevant topic, as you can see, discussing adrenal physiology and the stress response. And I'm correlating that with information that is related to methylation and its effects on mood, behavior, and mental health. Now, you might ask, how is it that you can blend these subject matters and come up with a meaningful interaction between the two? And I will tell you that adrenal physiology became an interest of mine because of the diverse and pervasiveness of the stress response that's been going on in our society for forever. And what I noticed was that so many different nutritional companies and different doctors try to always find the ideal adrenal physiology product, like that. Like, I need to find this nutrient that's going to be the, the golden egg here that's going to fix the problem. And the answer to that is that that's really an inappropriate way to think. It's not actually the right question. And as you go on in time of learning this subject matter and studying it, what you find is that, you gain in the knowledge about adrenal physiology and stress, and you learn the phases of adrenal exhaustion and the implications of nutrient interaction and diet and so forth, and stress reduction methodologies, and all of it is good, okay? But after a period of time, what you're going to notice is that your evolution of knowledge is going to keep saying, why? Why is it that I have to keep giving these things to my patients in order to support their stress response? And then what actually ends up coming is you come to a point of understanding is that perpetuators, drivers of adrenal exhaustion, are the actual ticket. That's where the golden egg is. It's looking at why is it that that stress response is so chronic, doesn't go away. What is it that I need to do in order to create restoration? And as you'll see as we go through, looking at methylation status and its effects on mood, behavior, and mental health is not the only, but it is such a critical and poignant aspect to what happens with humans in their stress response that you will see the clinical correlation that exists and the reason why I blended these subject matters together to help you both understand and create implementation strategies that are effective to help improve human health. So when we look at this subject matter, we want to be able to embrace two subjects. One is called nutrigenomics and one is called epigenetics. Not only are these happen to be current trending knowledge-based applications, and you will see more and more that the role of genetics and genomics are becoming etiologic mechanisms for predisposing factors that people need to understand. And when I say people, I'm talking about doctors and people who are in this field and nutritionists and so forth. So let that be. Nutrigenomics are nutrients, are understanding that nutrients exhibit powerful effects on our genes. The right nutrients help and the wrong ones hurt. So we have to take away this theory that, oh, they're only vitamins, they're only minerals, they're only botanicals. No, we need to actually become extremely knowledgeable and understand that the right ones do fit the key perfectly and that the wrong ones are problematic. And I will show you how that is so. And that foods exhibit profound effects on our genes and our physiology. And looking at that, we have to understand immunocompetence versus immune dysregulation, because when we talk about diets, which is this other huge subject matter, everybody says, oh, do this diet and do this diet. But ultimately, regardless of which methodology or pathway you might choose in order to give somebody a diet to say this will improve your health, there must be, the immune system has to be congruent with that way of eating. And so there is no one for everyone, but there are some diets that are clearly going to be much better for some than the other. And epigenetics encompasses dietary, environmental, and emotional experiences that influence genetic expression. In other words, while genetics are things that we are born with, it is the expression of genetics that's important, and the things that surround us, toxins, traumas, pollution, things, healthy or unhealthy, these are all the things that surround and bathe our genes, and the manifestation of epigenetics is what produces expression. And that's what's so important. It's not the genetics, it's the expression of genetics. And so adrenal physiology has to follow these same principles. So when we look at the adrenal response, we have to understand that stress is going to come from various origins. On one person, it may be more dominant one area than the other. However, physical, emotional, and chemical means are all drivers that create an adrenal response, okay? And so physical, for instance, people who have chronic pain are going to have a heightened cortisol response to their system. It's the prolonged nature of the stress and the adaptive capacity of the patient that is so important. Chemically, if your biochemistry is out of balance, it is not possible for the body to be in a state of harmonious regulation, and the adrenals are always picking up signals from your body, from the environment, and they're interacting. And your emotions are one of the most dominant, although all three are critical, and one maybe, as I said, more strongly involved in the adrenal response. However, there is always stress and there is always interaction, but it's really important to understand the relationship of this triad because it's going to come up over and over again. Now, stress is first perceived through the nervous system with a resultant hormonal activation. Thus, we call this a neuroendocrine response. Now, Hans Seele was considered the father of stress, and he wrote the classic test on stress in the 1930s, where he developed the general adaptation syndrome, or GAS, which is the manifestation of stress in the whole body over time. And that's really the key element right here, manifestation over time. Okay, so you perceive, you encounter a stressor, you perceive it through your nervous system, it stimulates your hippocampus, it then goes and signals your pituitary. Your pituitary signals ACTH, it goes into your systemic circulation, and it signals the adrenal cortex, and cortisol response is a manifestation. Thus, they call it a neuroendocrine response. So here it is again. In humans, any stressor, good or bad, stimulates the hippocampus to activate the hypothalamus to release corticotropic releasing factor, which travels through the hypophyseal portal system to the pituitary, stimulating ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. ACTH then travels through the systemic circulation to the adrenal cortex, where it releases the glucocorticoid cortisol. It's actually estimated that 75 to 90% of all visits to primary care physicians are for stress-related problems, regardless of the fact that patients show up with a particular manifestation. Unmanaged reactions to stress have been shown to be a greater risk factor for cancer and heart disease than cigarette smoking or eating high cholesterol foods. What happens once we have a significant reaction to stress? Well, immediately upon the activation of the pathway, the body begins an alarm reaction. It provokes gluconeogenesis, it decreases insulin sensitivity, amino acids become mobilized, proteins split or become catabolized, there's mobilization of free fatty acids from adipose tissue, there's decreased phagocytosis and white blood cell migration, there's decreased lymphocyte production, and there's disappearance of blood-borne eosinophils and lymphocytes, which right here on these last three are what you'll see as there's a reflection on the long-term effects of stress on immunity. And there is increased red blood cell production. So these are all adaptive, normal physiologic responses that are provoked when this pathway is activated. So it's imperative to understand the pivotal role that adrenal physiology plays in not only the apparent stress we see in our patient population and perceive in our own lives, but the long-term effects of overstimulation of the gland that it produces in chronic disease states. An incalculable amount of human morbidity and perhaps mortality exists due to the failure of physicians to understand and effectively treat the chronic stress response. As long as we've been on this planet, stress has been part of the human experience. Now, understand that there always was and there will always be stress. That is not the question, because short-term stressors are not problematic and they're normal. Long-term stressors are where we get into trouble. So we also have to look at how we interpret this concept of stress. So if I ask most people, what's stress? They will tell me things like, financial problems, woes, marital issues, stress, work, guilt, frustration, and so forth. And these are all true. But you also have to understand is that your adrenals are constantly signaling and reading your internal environment as well as your external environment, right? So all those things like financial woes and marital issues, these I'm going to call them external. Yes, they drive us to be frustrated and have anxiety and depression and guilt and worry, but they are outside effects and how we adapt or perceive them. Internal stressors, however, are, think about if you have chronic heart disease, if you have GI disturbances, if you have microbial overgrowth of a significant amount, your adrenals are picking up the signals that your body is laboring, that you're not healthy, that organ system is dysfunctioning, And so that will stimulate a similar response to the adrenals as one of the external ones. And so we have to look at the collective nature of where all the stressors are coming from and not just look at these external ones. So in the presence of stressors, the body almost immediately attempts to increase cortisol levels. This increase is associated with both an endocrine and an autonomic response in preparing the body to defend itself normally. However, elevated cortisol levels for extended periods, which is the key here, negatively affect virtually every aspect of physiology. For example, it becomes more difficult to maintain proper blood sugar levels, to slow down for rest, to recover, to repair, to get good quality sleep. Look how many people suffer right there. If we stopped right there, it's amazing. To balance hormones, to maintain mucosal immune integrity, to maintain bone mass, to produce effective general immune function, to effectively regulate the inflammatory process, or to detoxify. All of these are integrally related and tied into how your adrenals process and the stress response. Without proper intervention, continued high adrenal stimulation leads to adrenal exhaustion and lowered cortisol levels. Eventually, adrenal or cardiac failure can occur. And I need to just, everybody is always concerned with high levels of cortisol. But in a moment, as we get through this, I'm going to show you, based on the phases of adrenal exhaustion, where lowering cortisol is important, but in other places, we need to raise it. So let's take a look at the phylum of the actual adrenal tissue, because this gives us a representation of the physiologic output of the gland. So the outermost layer organizationally of the adrenal cortex is called, is the superficial layer of the cortex is known as the zona glomerulosa. Excuse me. And the mineralocorticoids are produced in that layer. And the most common mineralocorticoid that everyone knows is aldosterone, which regulates fluid and salts in your body and your blood pressure and so forth. The middle cortical layer is the zona fasciculata, and that produces what you know as to be the cortisol, which is the glucocorticoid. And then we have a deeper cortical layer known in the zona reticularis, which produces androgens like DHEA, dihydroepiandrosterone. All right, so which then becomes testosterone and progesterone and so forth. So what you're seeing here, based on this, the layering of these, is that you have mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and androgens that are all being made by that one organ in your body. And then those are some of the most salient production physiologic substances or hormones that it produces. And so it just shows you the depth of the need to understand how this gland works and the far-reaching effects when there's dysregulation. So all adrenal cortical hormones are synthesized from cholesterol. Cholesterol is transported into the inner mitochondrial membrane by steroidogenic acute regulatory protein, otherwise known as STAR, where it's converted into pregnenolone, which is the first hormone, by the enzyme CYP11A1. Accordingly, production of hormones in all three layers of the cortex is limited by the transportation of cholesterol into the mitochondria and by its conversion into pregnenolone. So I just want to make a little comment here to show that while most doctors are looking to lower elevated lipids in patients to reduce the prevalence of heart disease, we have to be careful not to lower the levels too far, because that steroid backbone is completely dependent on cholesterol. And if we go too low, we cause hormonal suppression. Now, let's take a look right over here, because this will give you a really excellent understanding of the development of where we go from the cholesterol molecule to how we form these various hormones. So we have low-density lipoproteins that form cholesterol, and with the aid of vitamin B5 and acetyl-CoA, we form this cholesterol backbone. And where is this? Yeah, okay, we form this cholesterol backbone, and then the first hormone that we make is pregnenolone. All right, so this is the first steroid hormone. Now, pregnenolone can go down two different pathways. Okay, so it can go down and directly form DHEA. And by the way, they call DHEA the mother hormone, but realistically, pregnenolone is really the mother. So they kind of interchange depending upon the author of what you're reading. But this is very important to see that pregnenolone is the mother hormone. And then it forms DHEA if it goes down this pathway, and it has a choice. And then if it forms DHEA, DHEA will form androstenedione, which will then go and form testosterone and form the various estrogens. However, pregnenolone can also shunt and go to the progesterone pathway, which will produce both aldosterone and cortisol. And cortisol then converts in the liver to cortisone. So this is a very regulatory effect upon inflammation. Now, understand this. A lot of people were at a certain point in their life, and of course women more than men, where they want to have their hormones regulated. Perhaps there's a decline based on age and so forth. And so what's key here to understand is that if you plug in testosterone to a man or a woman, estrogen to a woman, and you give them some replacement hormones, but you never go and balance adrenals that may be in trouble and depleted, you're going to run into a lot of trouble trying to get homeostasis in that person, and you're not going to get the response that you want because you actually needed to go up here and actually fix from this point, which is etiologic, and then go down and then see what kind of results you get by balancing the adrenal hormones, and then see what still needs to be done and treat it for a while, and then go and recheck your labs and see what kind of reactions you have. So now that we've reviewed the biochemical and the basic physiologic output of the adrenals, we must be able to utilize this knowledge and apply it in a clinical setting. So short-term stress is largely mediated by the catecholamines, adrenaline and noradrenaline, but there's always a cortisol output in response to stress, always. Long-term stress is regulated by cortisol and DHEA, which is why it's imperative to look at these biomarkers. And the relationship is critical to understand because the stress response induces alterations in these hormones, which affect our cellular energy and a plethora of other functions that are quite diverse and profound. So how can stress make you sick? We're hardwired for stress, make no doubt about it. Short-term stress is healthy and a normal response. Long-term stress is the detriment. Now, cortisol, epinephrine, and norepinephrine cause your heart to beat faster, raises your blood pressure over time, causes hypertension. Cortisol can cause your endothelium to become dysfunctional as well. Again, look again at the relationships that I'm showing you as the adrenal has to chronic health conditions and how important it is to create regulation in this space. This has been shown to actually induce atherosclerosis and cholesterol plaque buildup in arterial walls. And we're not even talking about the actual lipid, we're talking about an outside physiologic factor that's causing that interaction. Collectively, it increases your risk of heart attack or stroke. The autonomic nervous system activates and sends signals to your enteric brain or your gut, changing motility, and that has a component leading to irritable bowel syndrome. It increases your gut sensitivity to acid, making you more likely to feel heartburn. Via the gut's nervous system, stress can also change the consumption and function of your gut bacteria, which is your microbiome. This is a emerging, huge subject matter that clearly we can't address here, but look at the interaction is what I'm showing you of the relationship of adrenals to even the microbiome. And so this alters your many signaling molecules and can have far-reaching effects on one's health. So does chronic stress affect your waistline? Absolutely. So cortisol can increase your appetite. It tells your body to replenish your energy stores with energy-dense foods and carbs, and it causes you to crave comfort foods. High cortisol leads to increased visceral and deep belly fat. That's what's so deleterious. And this type and area of fat becomes an organ, actively releasing hormones and cytokines that increase your risk of developing chronic disease such as heart disease and insulin resistance. So QOL Labs came out with a really terrific formulation called Seroquat. And the reason why I like this is because everybody talks about these individual ingredients like 5-hydroxytryptophan to upregulate serotonin and rhodiola and so forth. These are adaptogenic herbs. But when you do a good job of making formulations and you know how to think and balance out formulas, you can see that it becomes a contextual process and not an isolation of individual ingredients that at times is more balancing to the system. So Seroquat provides raw materials that your body uses to upregulate serotonin, which helps support weight loss. It works on stress management, and it works on mood support. So it's a nice rounded formulation that you could consider for these issues. Stress and immunity. Initially, stress helps prepare your immune system by upregulating immune modulation and healing after injury. That's normal. But chronic stress, again, always, it's the chronic that's the problem. Chronic stress dampens immunity, and it makes you more susceptible to infection, and it slows the rate of healing. Now, if you think about how many people have chronic illness, and if that patient is not being monitored or managed for an adrenal stress response and to find out where their system is at, it's very, very difficult for this patient to get restorative care when in fact this organ system is imbalanced and has such a far-reaching effect as this is showing you. And so I want you to consider that no matter what, so whether someone has chronic heart disease, or they have GI disease and so forth, or any other types of long-term chronic illness, you consider looking at adrenal physiology and its relationship to balance that system while you're working on that target organ. And you will see that you will get an enhanced clinical outcome via that thinking and methodology of approach. And secreted IgA becomes impaired with the chronic stress response in many cases. And this is first-line mucosal defense, so it's very, very important to consider looking at that biomarker as well. Longevity and stress. Do you want to live long? You have to reduce your stress. Chronic stress has actually been shown to shorten telomeres. So on the chromosomes, we have these little caps on the end, and this is where your reproductive capacity, your cellular turnover is happening. And as those telomeres get shorter and shorter, we have less and less opportunity to recreate ourselves in essence. And so if chronic stress is actually driving them to become shorter before our normal maturation process, this is negative, this is reducing longevity. Not a good thing. And if that's not bad enough, prolonged stress actually causes hair loss, sexual dysfunction, headaches and muscle tension, chronic subluxations of the spine, difficulty concentrating, fatigue and irritability. when you think about stress, you always should be thinking about adaptation, because it's maladaptation or adaptation that wins the game. So your life will always be filled with stressful situations. It's how you react to and process stress that's important. If you can view these situations as challenges you can control and master, rather than as threats that are insurmountable, you will perform better in the short run and you will stay healthy in the long run. Coping, adaptation, keys to a healthy, longer life. Now, when we look at the individual factors associated with adrenal physiology, the two things that are going to come up the most is going to be cortisol and DHEA. These are counter-regulatory hormones that are being modulated depending upon the level and the chronicity of stress that you have. So DHEA is a metabolic hormone intermediate. It's a building block that has some hormonal characteristics of its own. We know this. And it's an important precursor for the estrogens and testosterone, as you saw. The most accurate way to measure DHEA is to measure it in the stable form that the body keeps it in, which is DHEA sulfate. So when you're running blood tests, be sure to write DHEA-S on the lab form. When you do salivary adrenal hormone profiles, you don't have to do that because the saliva already, it is sulfated in the saliva already, and it's unbound. So even DHEA that's taken by mouth as a supplement is quickly converted into the more stable sulfated form. The sulfated levels are usually higher in men than they are in women, and levels peak at around 25 to 30 years of age and decline with aging. And so you can look at that and say, well, so do all the other hormones, and that's true. So the decline of DHEA, however, with aging correlates with a general decline in immunity and lowered resistance to age-related diseases. So this is why they call DHEA an anti-aging substance. So consider repletion just on an anti-aging level, but you're also going to get alterations in it depending upon how long and how chronic the stress response is. The nice thing is that there's a biomarker that you can test for it. Decreased DHEA levels are noted in many chronic illnesses: obesity, decreased sex drive, chronic fatigue, rheumatologic disorders, insomnia, and depression. DHEA is one of the most important hormones produced by the gland, and it should be evaluated with cortisol, always. It should also be looked at whenever testosterone levels are low, since it's a precursor to testosterone. So you see, now that I make statements like this, if you can reflect on the graph that I showed you, it makes more sense. And when you're checking testosterone in a man who is at least 40, 45 years and up, always consider testing for estradiol at the same time, because men who are out of shape and have bellies, the more belly fat you have, the more you upregulate an enzyme called aromatase, and which makes that man convert his testosterone into estrogen. And so that's not a good thing. So now let's take a look at functional adaptation. So there are three distinct phases of adrenal exhaustion that have been isolated. Now, various laboratories define it in different ways, but BioHealth Diagnostic Labs was the first lab, and Dr. Timmons was a naturopathic physician who was the one who actually came up with this. He was the father of figuring out adrenal salivary hormone profiles. And so they continue to offer their studies, which are three basic phases of adrenal exhaustion. And then there are other labs that have expanded on it. And it's not like there's anything wrong with doing a more expansive approach, but you'll see from what I'm going to show you in a moment that the basics will get you exactly where you need to go. So while blood markers have a place in defining adrenal physiology, Cortisol levels are bound by protein fractions, and they don't always reveal what is biologically active. Therefore, salivary levels being unbound reflect a greater degree of accuracy. In addition, cortisol goes through a diurnal variation. So it's too difficult to have a patient go to a blood lab 4 times in a day, but salivary capture allows for patient's compliance and the ability to see where the patient spikes or depresses in their output. DHEA and other hormones are increasingly being tested this way for assessment in functional medicine. Standard allopathic models have yet to adapt this model. Hold on. So DHEA is the counter-regulatory hormone to cortisol. So according to the biohealth diagnostics, the preferential pathway under chronic stress is called pregnenolone steal or cortisol escape. When the body is in a chronic stress response, pregnenolone, the precursor, remember I showed you on the top of the chart, pregnenolone, the mother hormone, is the precursor to all the rest of the steroidal hormones, and under chronic stress, it's diverted to the cortisol-cortisone. This is to the detriment of the other steroidal hormones, progesterone, aldosterone, DHEA, its metabolites, and the hormones estrogen and testosterone. So as pregnenolone is diverted to the cortisol-cortisone, DHEA depletion begins. So the result is that there's an elevated cortisol to DHEA ratio, and the normal ratio is 5-to-1 or 6-to-1. But once you start doing salivary adrenal hormone profiles and you see the various stages of adrenal exhaustion that people have, you will see how far off the ratio goes. And it's really quite easy to read these tests. So the ratio is obtained just by dividing the cortisol sum by the DHEA and getting an average. So while the reference ranges for the 4 separate salivary captures are listed on the lab report, just like any blood lab would provide you a reference range, these values represent the cortisol sum and the DHEA average. So if you add up the 4 salivary captures, despite their individual nature that you need to look at, you will see that the range should be between 23 and 42 nanometers. But the optimal range is 34 to 36. And so just like in blood chemistry, where you have a reference range, there is also optimal ranges. And so here in functional medicine, we're striving to optimize human health. And so we look at those ranges, which are much tighter, in order to achieve enhanced outcomes. And the normal range for DHEA sulfate is between 2 and 10 nanograms per milliliter, and the optimal range is 7 to 8. So of the 3 phases, this is what I want you to be able to walk away with if you're not familiar, is that in phase 1, adrenal exhaustion is characterized by an increased output of cortisol, okay? Just where the total cortisol is too high. And this is where everybody says lower cortisol, but that's based on a phase 1 adrenal exhaustion. But phase 2 is a situation where the patient has been in a phase 1 for a prolonged period of time. And that varies. On one person, it could be 6 months, and another, it could be 5 years, because it's the adaptive capacity of the person that predicts that. But after the cortisol is high for a prolonged period of time, you have to understand the organ is trying to put out more and more cortisol to help you adapt to a chronic stress response. And so it does that, and it keeps you in that phase. But eventually, the gland actually tires or exhausts, which is why they use the term adrenal exhaustion, because the signaling from the pituitary to the cortex says, make more, and it's like not taking your finger off the doorbell. It's like, I hear you, but I can't put it out anymore. And so at that point, the gland actually goes into a phase 2, which is characterized by depressed cortisol levels with a borderline low or low DHEA. And then phase 3 is characterized by continued insufficiency of the gland to be able to output cortisol, and then you actually have depressed cortisol levels with borderline low or low DHEA levels. And so just think of those processes that are occurring, and then when you actually run the test, you will understand it to a better degree. So here's an example. This is biohealth, and notice cortisol in the morning. You see between 6 and 8 a.m. Where is this? Yeah. Between 6 and 8 a.m., here is a person, their result is 10.7. And here's the reference range of 13 to 24. So clearly, if they got a good night's rest and they were recovering and repairing, they would have a normal range, but they don't, right? So you have insufficiency after a night's rest, probably not sleeping well on top. Why is this thing like this? Okay. Then between 12 and 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it should be 5 to 8. And this person, it's 6.3. And so forth. And it goes on. And then 5.2, and it starts to normalize in this person. And then the nighttime cortisol is 0.9. So that's below level. And then you add all those four up, and then you end up with 23.1. And the DHEA, you see, should be 2 to 10. However, I said that 7 to 8 is an optimal range, so you can see how DHEA is depleted here. And then you divide the total sum of the cortisol over the DHEA, and instead of being a 5 to 1 to 6 to 1 ratio, you're seeing it being 12.8 to 1, which clearly is aberrant. And so this would be characterized by a phase 3 adrenal exhaustion. And so that's what these things look like. I just wanted to show you, we're not here to actually teach given the time constraints that we have, but this is what they look like, and should familiarize yourself and contact BioHealth, and I can provide the number if that's an interest to you. So then we interpret it. So we have to look at common inducers of cortisol, which include tissue damage, inflammation, pain, glycemic dysregulation, GI disturbances, as well as mental, emotional stressors, which is the elephant in the room. Underlying physiological stressors that may not be demonstrated by obvious symptoms include gluten or gliadin, lactose and sucrose intolerance, delayed food hypersensitivity, pathogens, and other inflammatory conditions. I mean, theoretically, you could go on ad infinitum about how many things can cause the body to be in a state of stress, which would then be a perpetuator of adrenal exhaustion. But you have to look at the big boys in the room. And so here, if you look, we're looking at what is it that drives adrenal corticotropic hormone. Well, tissue damage like chronic pain and inflammation, which a lot of people have, is going to put someone into a chronic stress response. Glycemic dysregulation. Think about how many people have blood sugar imbalances from hypoglycemia to hyperglycemia. We have nearly 50% of the American population of 300 million people are overweight, have insulin resistance or diabetes. Glycemic dysregulation is huge. And you have mental and emotional stressors, which who doesn't have some? But look how many people have. And if you actually go and look up the statistics of how many people are taking antidepressants and things of that nature and anti-anxiety medications to handle it, you get to see that these are the largest perpetuators of driving adrenal exhaustion. So that when we have mental and emotional stress, it causes the sympathetic nervous system to overflow. Boom, it hits the ACTH, and there you go, you start the whole chronic stress response. So the whole axis is called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. But there is also a hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, and that is important as well. So the well-known HPA axis provides the template for adrenal physiology. However, a less known axis is the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. And as endocrine systems interact with each other, keep in mind that the production of T3, or triiodothyronine, has a regulatory mechanism through these axes, and as cortisol elevates, there can be suppression of T4's conversion to T3 via reverse T3. So Don't always look at thyroid for thyroid again. Consider, or any other hormonal imbalance, look at the adrenals as well as the organ, and then try to make a correlation between the two. You know, one of the smartest things that I heard in a long time was a terminology called clinical, well, it's not just clinical correlates, it's not coming to me, but it will. Pardon. Okay. However, when it comes to treating, always treat fundamentals. So what do I mean? So we just finished saying that better than 50% of the population, or about that, has a sugar imbalance problem. So glycemic status is something that is critical to look at. Don't go doing salivary adrenal hormones in this test and that test and not looking at a basic blood chemistry that also has hemoglobin A1C, fasting insulins, because fasting glucose is insufficient, and so forth. And so cortisol increases blood glucose levels in response to stress. So look at it. This is a fundamental. Look at it, look at it, look at it. Okay. So defining the perpetuators, or the inducers of adrenal exhaustion via a functional medicine platform, requires a careful consultation and history, followed by additional lab testing to assist in etiologic mechanisms. One of the many benefits of the IAT model, which is a technique that I created, which is using muscle response testing in coordination with blood chemistries and functional medicine tests, is that it's a rapid determination through an algorithmic model that allows the practitioner a means of isolating and coarse reactivity, yielding either greater specificity in diagnostic choice or therapeutic options. So bioenergetics, because it's muscle response testing, meets biochemistry through an integrative model. So why correlation with chemistries are key if you're doing muscle testing. You cannot attain all the information about human health from muscle testing alone. But if you do it right, you can define a lot. Corroborating your findings between muscle testing, blood chemistries, and functional medicine algorithms provides a solid template for correlation and enhanced clinical outcomes. And I can show you ad infinitum how many cases this has led me to make this statement. Knowledge is having the right answer, but intelligence is asking the right question. And this is just a brilliant statement, because if you don't ask the right question, how are you going to ever go down the right pathway clinically? So this is just a model of showing you an adrenal reflex, which is located at 4 o'clock on the ring of the breast in my technique. So I just put it in here because that's the point you would actually test. Now, once you actually test either through muscle testing, and hopefully you're going to correlate and use your muscle, you're going to do salivary adrenal hormone profiles, and you're going to define the level of adrenal exhaustion, there are, and this is an algorithm to show you things that you should consider treating with. So if somebody has elevated cortisol and in a phase 1 adrenal exhaustion, then vitamin B6, P5P, vitamin C, various botanicals, dihydroepiandrosterone, pregnenolone, phosphatidylserine, and various adaptogens. Always consider adaptogenic herbs for the application and management of adrenal exhaustion. So here I just put more common ones like eleuthero and ashwagandha, maca, lemon balm, rhodiola, holy basil, bacopa, cordycepsis, folates, so forth. Okay. In phase 2, now remember, in phase 1, this was an elevation of cortisol. Now, when we go into 2 and 3, we're talking about depleted levels. So adrenal glandulars should be considered, DHEA, CalMag potassium is often needed because of the aldosterone changes, pregnenolone, licorice root in 2 sometimes, in 3 almost always, because licorice root increases the half-life of your existing cortisol. So it's very therapeutic for adrenal exhaustion. Sea salt Don't underestimate the power of that in exhaustion phases. As the aldosterone drops, so does the ability to hold on to fluids and salts, and these people typically have low blood pressures. Same thing in phase 3, in which you have similar adjuncts to phase 2, but sometimes people becomes, hold on, I just lost that. Sometimes in phase 3, a late stage phase 3, there is so much depletion that these people, these are the fibromyalgia patients, these are the chronic fatigue patients, that unless you provide physiologic hydrocortisol like Cortef, they may not recover properly, and so they need pharmacologic intervention at that point. Serenoline is another nice formula that was made by QOL Labs. It's an anti-stress supplement that works by sedating the central nervous system, causing drowsiness and impaired mental function. Serenoline alleviates the physical and the psychological stress of occasional stress while actually increasing energy and focus. So I really like this formula because lemon balm is a very regulating and relaxing herb for people. It helps them sleep, it helps them relax more. Sensorol is ashwagandha. That is a whole conversation unto itself, but ashwagandha is just a fabulous adaptogenic herb that both decreases the stress response, decreases some anxiety in people. L-theanine is the extract from green tea that is also very calming. And pharma-GABA, because when people have high stress, they tend to have more anxiety. And so when you put all these together as a formulation, it's very calming and so forth. But I want to make a little correction before saying that most anti-stress supplements sedate. This formula does not cause sedation or drowsiness or impaired mental function, but just brings people down to the threshold that allows them to feel calm and comfortable inside rather than the high stress states that exist. So stress hormones that are released are epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. So you have both catecholamines and you have cortisol. So brain waves go on high alert. The body reacts to stress. It's a fight or flight reaction. You have increases in heart rate. You have increases in blood pressure and breathing rate, elevation in blood sugar to provide energy for the action. You have shutdown of non-essential functions, digestion and reproduction become impaired. Mind reacts to stress, anxiety, depression, irritability, and moodiness. The sensorol, right, the ashwagandha, is a proprietary extract of that herb and has been clinically shown to balance two hormones. It reduces the level of the stress hormone cortisol, and it boosts the level of energizing hormone DHEA, which is a beautiful thing through a natural botanical. L-theanine, we just said, the amino acid in green tea generates alpha brainwaves within 30 to 40 minutes, so you can see why relaxation states and sleeping are benefited. And GABA, an inhibitory neurotransmitter, takes longer to exert its effect, like an hour, but it's even better at producing alpha brainwaves than theanine. So you use these collectively to get a better clinical response. The multiple actions of that product are that it balances stress hormones, it produces calming brain waves, it reduces symptoms of chronic stress, and it improves stress-induced negative mood. Sensorol ashwagandha has been shown in double-blind placebo-controlled studies to reduce anxiety, heart palpitations, irritability, inability to concentrate, fatigue, and sleeplessness. Lemon balm alleviated negative moods in study subjects compared to placebo. It's a very nice botanical. Okay, so here in the IAT model is a flow chart I use when I'm muscle testing to identify the various neurotransmitters. So we're looking at GABA and PEA, phenylethylamine, taurine, serotonin, dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, glutamate, acetylcholine, and histamine. This is a actual check sheet that we use, and we are able to pulse and actually get a numerical value so we know how the alterations are and we mark them, and then we test for the various nutrients to identify the best source of help for the patient. Okay. Positiva, another formula that can be considered for the stress response, has quatrefolate, which is methylfolate, vitamin D, Benetron, rhodiola, and lavender oil. Very calming. It safely uplifts mood. It promotes feelings of calm. It encourages restful sleep. And what I like is that it supports all three aspects of the mood-related stress disturbance. So you'll find that some people respond better to some formulas than other, and your clinical experience will dictate which you want to use. But these are beautiful formulas. Nutrigenomics. Nutrigenomics is a branch of nutritional genomics and is the study of the effects of foods and food constituents on gene expression. This means that nutrigenomics is research focusing on identifying and understanding molecular level interaction between nutrients and other dietary bioactives with the genome. Nutrigenomics has also been described by the influence of genetic variation on nutrition, by correlating gene expression or SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, with the nutrients absorption, metabolism, elimination of biological effects. So by doing so, nutrigenomics aims to develop rational means to optimize nutrition with respect to the subject's genotype. And just like we're using the application of nutrients to a person's genes, we're also, you have to understand, medicine is looking at genomics and the role of your ability to metabolize and utilize various medications. Future forecasting. The genomic understanding of how food interacts with our genes and our SNPs, which are mutations, is likely to change the way we've been diagnosing and treating people, from the foods that are right for us to the medicines that we use. And the MTHFR SNP is a perfect example. So everybody seems to be interested in, and rightly so, to understand the genetics in the relation to MTHFR. Somehow that has become the preeminent SNP or mutation to know whether it's present or not. So what MTHFR is, which is methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase, is the actual enzyme that is responsible for the metabolism of folic acid. Now, SNPs, or the single polymorphisms, are mutations on genes. So that there are two actual SNPs that are possible for MTHFR. One is called A1298C, and the other is C677T. Now, there are only those two, so it shouldn't drive you crazy in figuring this out. But what we need to know is the following. You want to know whether someone has a mutation on that gene. Can they metabolize folic acid? So you run the MTHFR test, and then when it comes back, you want to know the following. If a person has one copy of C677T or A1298, there is a mild decrease in that person's ability to metabolize folates or folic acid. And this is termed the heterozygous effect on the gene. It's the presence of one copy. If you have two copies of the SNP, then it's considered homozygous, homo for the word same for the trait, and you have a higher risk of expressing this genotype. If you have one copy of C677 and one of A1298, but you have both, but you have one of each, then you have what's called compound heterozygous, and you're at a similar risk for being homozygous. Now I'm going to show you how this ties in. If a person is homozygous for C677T, which means they have two copies, we know that this mutation regulates homocysteine synthesis, okay? Now, homocysteine is a marker, cardiovascular, and is important for the health of your vascularity. And it's been related to the development of various dementia-related illnesses as well as the cardiovascular status. So if a person is homozygous for A1298C, we know that this mutation has a higher affinity for the neurotransmitter synthesis via what's called BH4 tetrahydrobiopterin, and can directly influence serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. And this is where the relationship exists for why I'm showing you this in relation to adrenal physiology, because I'm telling you that the chronic stress response is so often associated with alterations in mood, behavior, and mental health, and you have to be able to have a means other than the old world way of psychiatrists of just typing people out to see where they're at, and you're looking at a genetic test and its probability of how it may affect mood, behavior, and mental health. So if the person has homozygous for C77T, then that's more the cardiovascular homocysteine side. And if they are homozygous or compound heterozygous, they may express it mental emotionally. So folate is a vital component of the single carbon pool that participates in basic cellular processes such as amino acid metabolism, synthesis of nucleotides, and methylation. Okay, low levels of folate are implicated in increased risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke, dementia, depression, cancers, and birth defects. Similarly, high levels are also associated with carcinogenesis. So it's really important because people have been taking high levels of folic acid, or even mothers to be, because they said, oh, this reduces the incidence of spina bifida. And that is correct, that it did have that correlation. However, what they didn't know at the time was whether or not the person had the gene to metabolize folic acid as opposed to methylfolate. And so now you have a two-edged sword. But if you do the genetics prior, you know which form to use not to cause the problem. Because if you have the mutations and you can't metabolize folic acid and you take high doses for a long time, this can create carcinogenesis in the liver. And that's where now this greater understanding of nutrigenomics is beginning to actually show us that certain nutrients in certain forms and certain metabolites are so important to understand. So the folate cycle feeds into other key biochemical cycles as well, and the end product of folate metabolism is 5-MTHF, and it's an essential precursor to the neurotransmitter metabolism for dopamine, for serotonin, and for norepinephrine. So it's necessary for the production of SAMe, which participates in 200 enzymatic reactions in the body. Now, real quick, because we're running short on time here, CH3 is methyl. Okay, and so here's the basic. Don't let this chart freak you out if you're not used to seeing the methylation chart. Methionine is the amino acid basic that has to form into homocysteine. Whoop, that's not good. Okay, methionine has to form into homocysteine. Homocysteine then should go circle back up into methionine. If you have enough B6, B12, folic acid in the right form, and trimethylglycine, then you will effectively methylate, and methionine will become homocysteine and it'll go back up. If you have either an inability to metabolize the folates and or insufficiency of any of those nutrients, then methionine becomes homocysteine. Homocysteine cannot cycle back into methionine effectively, and your homocysteine levels rise in the bloodstream. And that's where the problem comes in, and that's why C677T homozygous can be an issue. Then, but real quickly, if we shunt from this, it's all one big cycle. But if you go from here, here's the MTHFR gene, okay? And here, folic acid becomes 10-formyl, okay? And so when your folate metabolism is not working right, especially if it's A1298C, it affects the BH4 cycle, the tetrahydrobiopterin, and that affects serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, okay? And so that's the relationship in the biochemistry. Okay, so But of the various methylation, of all the various methylation functions in the body, the key is to determine overall status. And if the one thing you walk away with genetically understanding, if you didn't beforehand, is do not treat genetics. Treat biochemistry. Genetics give you predisposition. Chemistry gives you expression. So despite looking at the 5-MTHFR or the MTHFR SNP and what alleles are present, it's whole blood histamine or a SAMe to SOR ratio that determines one's methylation status, because there are over 20 different SNPs that contribute to the methylation process, not just MTHFR, and whole blood histamine will give you the global answer to that status. And what you're actually trying to figure out is whether the person is a normal methylator, are they an over-methylator, or are they an under-methylator? So if whole blood histamine is high, the patient is under-methylated. It's inverse. And if the whole blood histamine is low, the patient is over-methyl. So do not give methylfolate to under-methylated patients who present with issues of mood, behavior, and mental health, or they'll get worse. And there's a lot of science that goes behind that statement that is too long to go through over here. But trust me, this is a very strong, important thing to use. So if you just start running these genetic tests and everybody says, oh, I am this, I have this gene, and I'm taking methylfolate, and you have issues with mood, behavior, and mental health, it's imperative that you know the expression via whole blood histamine and that you do not treat just based on the SNP alone. And that's what this says over here, but we got to really blow through this. And this presentation will be available for you as a download at a previous time, so you can read through this at your leisure. Okay? So we're going to have to bypass this right now because we ran out of time. But I just want you to understand that a global understanding of how the brain works is that neurochemically you have excitatory and you have inhibitory neurotransmitters. And if there are too many excitatory hormones and not enough inhibitory, you will have excess excitation, and the things like glutamate and PEA and epinephrine and norepinephrine will produce that, and GABA and taurine and serotonin are calming. And so we want to create a balance between the two. So when you're considering etiologic mechanisms that induce HPA axis disruptions, you got to look for emotional discord as a primary driver, which is what I was just talking about, and identify the neurotransmitter status and the role of natural medicines which produce profound changes in your patient population when balancing patterns of adrenal exhaustion. This just talks about what GABA is. And lastly is, what is a Pyrrole disorder? Because a lot of people don't understand, why do I have so much anxiety? How come I can't get rid of it? Why do I have to live on benzodiazepines? Well, a certain percentage of the population have what's called a Pyrrole disorder. Everybody has hemoglobin. Everybody breaks down hemoglobin. And there's a urinary metabolite called pyrroles that we make. Some people, they make a normal amount of pyrroles, they excrete it in their urine, there's no problem. But genetically, a certain percentage of people make a lot of pyrroles. And what's the significance of that? Those pyrroles bind to vitamin B6 and to zinc. And so you cause excessive excretion of zinc and excessive excretion of B6. Why would that cause mental emotional problems? Because B6 is necessary for the conversion of glutamate to GABA. B6 is necessary for the conversion of 5-HTP to serotonin. B6 is necessary for L-DOPA to convert into dopamine. And as zinc depletes, copper elevates, and as copper elevates, you have more conversion of dopamine into norepinephrine, and so you have a chronic excitatory state. Okay, that's the whole issue with pyrroles. The rest are just some more details with that. There's a laboratory called Direct Health that does this testing that I left you the data with. And these are some of the most common associated symptoms and expressions that people have Pyrrole disorders. And understand that when you have a Pyrrole disorder, you have high oxidative load because as copper goes up, zinc is an antioxidant, copper is an oxidant. As copper is high and zinc is low, you have high oxidative loads. And so this expresses how you do this and the ratios and how important it is to look. And I gave you the numbers and the ramifications of it. There's a basic calculator that you can use to convert copper and ceruloplasmin, which is copper bound, to protein so that you can actually come up with the percentage of free copper to know whether your patient is expressing that. Lastly, there is a wonderful formula called Metasol, which is actually a low molecular weight lychee polyphenol called oleganol that was developed in Japan. And other than it being a fantastic antioxidant, it actually has a terrific role in exercise. It shows lowering of exercise-induced cortisol. And if you know anything about people who exercise a lot, especially the people, professional bodybuilders and people who really want to be fit, they all want to lower cortisol in relation to high intensity workouts. And so this would be a beautiful formula that you would consider in addition to other nutrients that you might want to see. They actually did a study on the effects of the oral intake of cortisol and related cytokines, which are inflammatory in healthy young men, and they found that oleganol reduced post-exercise cortisol in these subjects. So what you do matters. Active pursuit of knowledge gives you objective tools to measure outcomes. Do muscle testing, do functional medicine testing, do blood chemistries, and you get outstanding clinical results. Thank you so much, and Max, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Marks. We're now going to begin answering the questions portion submitted during our presentation by all of our participants. The first one that we have is this very interesting one from Nicole. She says she has a female 35-year-old patient who on labs has normal cortisol and low DHEA and low testosterone. Also low ferritin, normal CBC. Just trying to figure out what stage she is in after listening to your webinar. Can infertility be a result of adrenal fatigue?
Okay, the answer is yes, fertility can definitely be affected by adrenal fatigue. When you said the first two things, there was no salivary hormone run, I believe that this was all blood. Is that correct, Max?
Yeah, she says, what's the timing in healing adrenal fatigue? But she says that low ferritin, normal CBC, and it was low normal cortisol and low DHEA and low testosterone.
Right, a normal cortisol. Now, here's the point. On blood chemistry, you're going to, unless the person actually has adrenal illness, like, like very, very severe adrenal alteration, Addison's disease and things of that nature, you're not going to see a whole lot of ability to be able to read cortisol on a blood test. So you're going to need to do a salivary hormone profile to actually get the answer. And they actually have an expanded panel that also includes some of the salivary hormones, and you might want to consider that because you'll get a lot more information about how to regulate the rest of her cycle and the ability for her to conceive by doing that. So right now you have good labs that don't show you anything that gives you an answer, but you need to move into the functional medicine model, and then you'll get more answers to what you need.
Our second question of the day comes from Anonymous, who says, thanks for the great talk, Dr. Marks. Would you expand on the GGT and matched insulin test?
Okay, it was GTT. Okay, so the GTT is looking at glucose tolerance test, and so one of the better ways of actually being able to identify glycemic dysregulation is, other than running a fasting glucose, which clearly is insignificant, as an entity by itself, is you clearly want to do a hemoglobin A1C to give you a measure, or a fructosamine level, so you can see a better marker of the way they're expressing their blood sugar. But in some people, doing a glucose tolerance test is the most effective way, because when you do a GTT for 2 to 3 hours and you ask to have matched insulins, you're getting both the value of the sugar at those phases along with the output of the insulin. And so you're actually getting to see the reactive capacity of the physiology against time and the load of glucose that they gave you. It has tremendous value, and for a long time it was the only game in town. But they're actually, there's a doctor by the name of Chris Kresser who wrote a very, very good article recently on not looking at that as a way of testing it, but to do an A1C and a fasting sugar and a fasting insulin, and then have the patients get a glucometer and actually test in a certain way over 3 hours based on different foods that they eat. But that's a larger answer, but that is the way to understand this.
Well, thank you, Dr. Marks. We're running a little bit behind time. Sorry I didn't get everyone's question today, but thank you for being a part of this amazing webinar, Adrenal Physiology and the Stress Response Correlated with Methylation Status and its Effects on Mood, Behavior, and Mental Health. If anyone has any other questions for Dr. Marks, please contact us via email, info@qollabs.com. I'd be happy to pass those questions along. You'll also be receiving a follow-up email from me within the next few days with a link to view a recording of today's webinar and product promotion for those interested in placing an order for the products that Dr. Marks talked about from QOL for the nutritional supplements. So thank you very much, and just want to say good night to everybody, and thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.